Welcome, everyone, and welcome to the other committees with USAHA that are joining us for the Bovine Germplasm Movement Plan. We have an excellent lineup of speakers to present on this, and then there are some 4 resolutions for consideration at the upcoming USAHA meeting that I think they'll touch on as well. So I think Dr. Keith Poulsen is going to be the first presenter today. And I will go ahead and let them start their presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm really excited to talk about the Bovine Germplasm Movement Plan that we've been working on now for almost 2 years. And this is funded by a NADPRP project through Farm Bill and USDA. We have a great team here involved, and it's a multidisciplinary project. My name is Keith. I'm the director at the Wisconsin Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory. We're a non-level 1 laboratory, and we're really tasked with maintaining agribusiness and large animal, food animal health and productivity. We do see a significant amount of TSE testing and some companion animal. Other people on my team really is Dr. Charlie Brown, who's the Chief Global Security Veterinarian at Peak with the URUS Corporation, and he'll be speaking today as well. Dr. Darlene Konkle, our Wisconsin State veterinarian, who we work with on a regular basis in multiple different facets, and Dr. Ilam Lim, who just joined us, who's our section head of virology and molecular diagnostics here at the Wisconsin Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory. And last but certainly not least is the glue that keeps us all together, right? Our highly experienced logistical coordinator, and was really helping us get this plan together, get it moving, get all the different contact matter experts together, and sort through everyone's really important feedback, and that's Danelle, Dr. Bickett-Weddle. So thank you very much to Danelle and Preventalytics. With this idea of developing a bovine germplasm movement plan, Danelle, maybe you could go to the next slide. Thank you. Is that the caseload here at WVDL, and I think Wisconsin's blessed to have a lot of bovine, specifically dairy veterinarians. We also have a large chunk of the bovine genetics industry within the state, and they branched out with different subsidiaries. But we have a large amount of bovine germplasm production, and a lot of it is for either domestic and then international use as well. And we have secure milk, we have secure beef, and we talked about secure pork in the previous discussion, but we don't really have a plan to maintain the genetic supply. And we all know from our experiences with COVID and our other FMD exercises that we have to maintain continuity of the industry. And the interesting and unique component of this particular industry, the bovine germplasm industry, is that North American genetics is head and shoulders above anybody else in the world. We need to be able to keep that competitive edge on our market and our industry, and we need to make sure that we're getting cows bred, so we get new cows and continued milk. So that's really what the purpose and some of our objectives for this grant are, is to build a plan or guidance that to draft a secure bovine germplasm movement plan. We did that by establishing a working group of stakeholders. There's 3 different groups. One group represents industry, so we have all of the major players, or a good representation of the major players in embryo and semen production from North America, Canada, and the United States. And many of those have international subsidiaries. Our second group was the laboratory group. So we need a diagnostic test, or we need to be able to facilitate deployment of diagnostic tests throughout the non-laboratory network. So we have the laboratory group, and there's a small group of, there's mid-60s, I think 66 non-labs, and there's about 5 or 6 of us handle the majority of that diagnostic testing for endorsement of export health certificates. But we did get participation from many of our other peer labs around the country as well. And then the last one would be the state animal and federal animal health officials, where we're looking at the regulatory and how to endorse movement. What are we looking for to endorse a movement permit, and how are we going to handle this in control zones? The next objective, and we met, our first meeting was in May of 2022 in Madison, and we had a great meeting talking about the current state of the industry, the things that we would need to build, and then those groups met throughout the next year and a half to where we are now to have a plan drafted with everybody's input. And that's really where we are now with multiple resolutions that we're going to talk about today with a drafted plan. And part of that plan was to determine what the surveillance criteria are. That's our second objective, is we needed to determine what surveillance criteria did we need, what kind of sample types, how often should they be tested, what kind of reagents will we need, what would be the lab capacity. It's our first question from Don at all times, that how would this affect our network capacity, especially if we're dealing with more than one outbreak at a time, whether it's African swine fever or if we have a different foreign animal disease outbreak. We're still at the tail end of our highly pathogenic avian influenza outbreak, and how would we manage that with an FMD to make sure that we can maintain all of the agribusiness industries to the best of our ability. Then our last objective then would be to exercise this drafted plan. And part of it we're going to talk about today, as well as the resolutions. And we're going to do that in December back here in Madison. December is always a great time in Madison. I guess that depends on your perspective. But with all of the seasons, it's going to be hopefully cold and snowy for those of us who love outdoor winter sports. But we're going to test that plan in December. We'll have an after action report, and that will summarize this project to see where we're going to go next, probably with some risk assessments and hopefully more test development. Can you go to the next slide, Danelle, please? Thank you. So again, here's our team. Oh, I forgot to mention Kurt Grakowski, who is the emergency animal coordinator at the Wisconsin Department of Ag, Trade, and Consumer Protection. But we've been working with Kurt as well. And this is a picture from our meeting in May of 2022. You can see multiple industry representatives from both embryo and semen production, as well as state animal health officials from the Southwest and Eastern part of the United States. And then we have the National Association of Animal Breeders, NAAB, and Certified Semen Services as represented as well. So I think with that is we're going to move on to Dr. Brown.
Thank you, Keith, and thank you everyone for your time and the opportunity to speak today. Just to give you a brief overview of the industry, the scope and size. We'll go to the next slide and talk about the industry working group members. Major AI centers involved are ABS Global, Genus, PIC, Peak and Urus, Select Sires, CMEX Bovatech, ST Genetics, Transova Genetics, Hawkeye Breeders, and NAB CSS, along with representation from Origin, a custom collection center in Montana. The committee members are all listed here on that screen. So just to give you an idea of what happens in the AI and ET industry in the U.S., about 75% of the cattle in the U.S., about 17 million units are used annually in dairy cattle. 7 to 10% of the beef cattle in the U.S. are bred AI, but there are 8.6 million units sold. A lot of those units, almost 3/4 of those units, are as beef semen being used in dairy herds today. There are about 50 semen collection production centers in 17 states in the U.S. Those production centers manage between 50 and 2,000 bulls at each. Multiple barns involved with those great big centers, managing up to 2,000 head. Another important note to note is that about half the business for major custom collection center or production centers is international business. So with an FMD incursion, we all recognize that exports would essentially the major centers would lose half of their semen sales instantly with a FMD outbreak in the U.S. But we do collect and do a lot of post-collection testing on bulls to meet export requirements, and a lot of semen testing on bulls to meet export requirements as well. The embryo transfer business is big and is growing rapidly, especially the in vitro IVF work. You can see that there were 229,000 aspirations, OPU events in 2021, 23,000 in vivo embryos. And then that's in dairy. And then in beef, you can see the beef has grown and is quite busy as well. And that's in 43 states. I want to go to that next slide just so you can see the complication and the ease in which animals move throughout the U.S. It really starts with, if you start with the semen production center, and then semen is shipped to a lab or to a storage area. Some of that semen goes to an IVF lab where recipients are standing, and or where oocytes are shipped to, and oocytes are fertilized, and then 7 days later, those oocytes are transported to recipient herds or recipient locations, and pregnancies are established. Those calves are then, when they're born, genomic samples are taken, tissue samples are taken, and about 30 to 40 days later, we know the genomic results of those calves, and those elite donor males and females go to a calf grower, or go back to the semen production center at their calf growing site. And then the high genomic females go to a farm or ET facility or a satellite center to then go through the process again. So as an example, I think our next screen will show you a bit more about what goes on. There's this whole cycle on the left side is happening weekly. There are OPU events, fertilization events, embryo shipments, implantations. Calves are we get genetic information on calves weekly, and there are quarterly updates for the whole industry. But it's a continuous flow system of both calves, oocytes, embryos, and young stock of high genomic value to grower herds or back to the AI centers. The semen movement is continuous as well. Production center semen shipped to a storage center or lab, and then the semen, some of that semen from the young genomically advanced males will go to IVF labs to help produce those embryos. But then that semen also goes to field staff, to dairies, sales, dairy and beef ranches, and field staff for sales, and of course, internationally as well. So just an example from one of the businesses that were in this committee, there are 30,000 embryos implanted between a year, resulting in about 10,000 calves. And out of those 10,000 calves, about 220 bulls actually go into production annually. There's probably 300 bulls that actually go to the AI center, and out of those 300, 220 actually go into production. The rest of those calves are all sold at private or public auction, depending on their merit. Most of the bulls actually would enter into the food supply chain, and the females would be sold as a rule private sale to interested dairy producers. You can see, so there's quite a high selection intensity. just as an overview on FMD and semen embryos and oocytes, semen from bulls that are infected with FMD can transmit virus via semen. And one study showed that the semen did not lose viral titer after 320 days frozen liquid nitrogen in commercially processed semen. That was done in 1968. Bovine oocytes, early embryos have a zona pellucida. Conventional produced embryos, the virus is loosely attached and can be removed by washing. IETS considers the risk of FMD virus transmission negligible in vivo derived cattle embryos as negligible if handled properly. And there is no approved treatment to remove FMD virus from in vitro IVF produced embryos. Did you want me to present this draft, or are we going to do that? Dr. Konkle, are you going to do that one?
This one's yours, Charlie.
Okay. So we do have a draft resolution, and it's regarding the movement of in vivo derived bovine embryos in an FMD outbreak. We would urge USDA to exempt in vivo derived embryos from the 72-hour national movement standstill. Storage tanks would need, exteriors would need to be properly C&D'd with appropriate disinfectant. And we urge state to allow movement from at-risk monitored premises on a CVI rather than an outbreak movement permit.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Dr. Brown. And I think we'll have time for questions at the end as well. But I'm Darlene Konkle. I'm state animal health official, state veterinarian for Wisconsin, and was a member of the state animal health officials working group. So our group was the second arm of this endeavor. Here's the names of the working group members, which include both state and federal animal health officials. And I just want to give a shout out to that group. Had a lot of very good discussions, in-depth discussions, and a lot of expertise shared in this group. We asked for members from the top 10 dairy and beef production states, and we got those, and also looked at where the major germplasm production units are in the country. So that was basically the makeup of this group. And the topics we concentrated on are listed here. We started with, had to start somewhere. So we started with the Secure Beef Supply Plan. We thought that was the best fit, at least for a start, to look for movement permit guidance criteria. And we looked at topics related to premises ID numbers, traceability records, and biosecurity parameters to use to establish that premises are not an infected suspect or contact premises, and that would be even eligible to move. We knew and sought input from them, but industry was looking for input from state and federal animal health officials on what's that biosecurity going to have to look like? What are those biosecurity measure expectations? And we also reviewed active observational surveillance guidance from the Secure Beef Supply Plans and for the other Secure Food Supply Plans, and provided input related to germplasm and high genomic animal movement. So one of our first endeavors to gather more information from our peers as state and federal animal health officials, we sent a survey, a 9-question survey, out to the National Assembly of State Animal Health Officials about a year ago in the summer of 2022. And we wanted to learn more about expectations for enhanced biosecurity plans to be able to guide industry on that endeavor. So 35 states responded to that survey, which is a pretty good response rate. We were pleased with that. And of those 35 states, 22 of them said they would require an enhanced biosecurity plan for the origin premises as one component for the movement of bovine germplasm, including semen, oocytes, and embryos in the event of an FMD outbreak. 3 out of those 35 states said they would not require an enhanced biosecurity plan. And 10 states were unsure. Of those last 13 states, the 3 that said they wouldn't require it and the 10 that said they really didn't know yet at this point, those 13 states, we asked if they fully support all livestock facilities having an enhanced biosecurity plan in place in an FMD outbreak. And 8 out of the 13 agreed with that statement and 5 were unsure. So based on the results of that survey, I think you can go to the next slide, Danelle. We understood and the importance from our peers, from state and federal animal health officials, that an enhanced biosecurity plan is going to be important. And in a lot of cases, it's going to be a required component of a movement permit for bovine germplasm. So we then got to work and evaluated the guidance that was already there in secure beef, secure milk, and secure pork resources, and created a guidance document that suggested that industry use the secure food supply template that best represents their facility type, because each was a little different. And we provided that as an appendix in the Bovine Germplasm Movement Plan document. So that was really valuable information for us to have. I think you can go into the next slide, Danelle. Our next big project was looking at what does disease surveillance and monitoring look like to get to the point of establishing these premises as monitored premises. Because in the FMD Red Book, premises would need to have the status of a monitored premises to be able to move by permit. So the surveillance in an FMD outbreak aims to find infected animals as early as possible, obviously, after exposure and through observation and testing. One thing that was a challenge for us as state animal health officials, it's always a challenge for us as state animal health officials, is that in general, we are more comfortable when we have a test, when we have a test report in hand that says not detected for whatever agent it is that we're looking for. And for foot and mouth disease, there is no established protocol or policy for decision-making based on test results for animals with no clinical signs. So secure milk supply, not based on any testing criteria. Secure beef supply, same for FMD. So we dug into that a little more in our working group and expanded on the guidance provided in the secure beef supply and looked at specific surveillance protocols for domestic bovine germplasm movement and also the movement of these high genetic merit animals. So what we came up with, that surveillance could include completing or updating an epidemiology questionnaire to determine the exposure risk. And that would be actually kind of a repeated thing at times. And then documenting active observational surveillance for at least 28 days prior to requesting a permit. So periodic inspection of animals and daily active observational surveillance records would be reviewed by regulatory officials or their designees. Follow-up laboratory testing could then be done for any animals with suspicious clinical signs. And we could get to a point, and I think the lab group's going to talk about this a little bit more, diagnostic testing for specific populations and sample types down the line. So a little bit more on those requirements for 28 days. It's longer than the 14 days of active observational surveillance described in the enhanced biosecurity plan templates for herds receiving semen or embryos. And the rationale for having a 28-day active observational surveillance period was based on the potential risk of disease spread in the event the donor animal was infected but undetected. So we wanted that extra cushion of the extra 14 days, which is 2 incubate. The total of 28 is obviously 2 incubation periods. And we also based that recommendation on the potential impact of disease spread due to the broad distribution of this material. So units of semen and embryos can go to multiple herds. And should donor animal testing become available, as we recommend in the plan, this duration of active observational surveillance could then be decreased to 14 days if we had more diagnostic testing available in the future. And I think then we can go on to the resolution. I'm going to go over here a little bit, the second of the ones you'll hear about today. I'll skip to the actual resolution itself. The U.S. Animal Health Association urges USDA to exempt the following bovine germplasm products from a national movement standstill issued due to an FMD diagnosis. So we're urging exemption for frozen bovine semen and frozen in vivo derived and in vitro produced bovine embryos that are collected or created more than 28 days prior to the first US FMD diagnosis, so long as there are records to document the collection date and the origin of these materials is not an infected suspect or contact premises. Semen, embryos, and oocytes collected from live donor animals during the standstill can move to a laboratory or storage facility that does not have livestock on the premises, so long as the movement is recorded and the origin is not an infected suspect or contact premises. And this resolution also includes C&D of exterior storage tanks prior to the movement, and movements of frozen bovine semen and in vitro produced bovine embryos collected or created less than 28 days prior to the first US detection will be subject to the movement restrictions determined by responsible regulatory officials based on the unique characteristics of the outbreak. So the draft of this resolution is in the hands of this committee, as well as Diseases of Cattle and Bison Committee and the Foreign Animal and Emerging Diseases Committee. And with that, we can move on to the laboratory group.
All right, thanks, Dr. Konkle. So the laboratory group was made up of non-member laboratories. And our role was really to look at the diagnostic test development that might be needed, what type of samples would we need to validate, and then how would we manage that through the null SOPs. So whether that's through deviation or emergency use authorization. And then we met and we will then present our resolutions here. And after meeting with our laboratory director committee, the joint committee on null, and then we'll follow up with them afterwards with our exercise and our hot wash. Can you go to the next slide, please? Here's our members from all over the country, and these are really, they represent the states with quite a bit of diagnostic testing, and they manage our germplasm production centers, whether it's a AI production center or embryos or even transfer points. So we're very well versed in the industry. Can you go to the next slide? All right, so we have two types of diagnostic testing. Some of it is we think about this laterally with some of our endemic diseases and how we manage that for endorsement of export health certificates. But then when we come back to specifically for FMD, we have two. One is an ELISA that would look for antibody testing. So obviously antibody testing is going to be something that's 2 to 4 weeks after infection. But the good news here is that we have a commercially available kit that is, well, not we as in Vettel has this kit, and they've been evaluating this kit in the recent past. And that's where we're going to see some of our resolution is how to develop that and be able to proficiency test it. And then we also have the ability to really look for real-time antigen, and we use that with real-time reverse transcriptase PCR, looking for a virus or antigen, whether that's in an oral swab. And then we also look at other sample types for other endemic diseases. But for FMD, we're going to look in serology and ELISA looking for antibody, and then focus on oral swabs for PCR testing. Can you go to the next slide? So Vettel has validated serum ELISA for foot and mouth disease. And really what we're looking for is to determine the serologic status of donor animals on collection day. So it's very similar, so I can kind of think translationally to how we do, let's say, for example, leptospirosis, is that we're going to have a test before and after collection to show that there's been the animal's antibody free before it's collected, and then at a prescribed time after collection. And that's really the same thing that we have for the idea of developing protocols for a serum ELISA for FMD. And the great thing about bovine germplasm is that it's not a fresh use product. It's easy to store, and we have a huge amount of inventory available. So Vettel is interested in deploying this test to non-labs, probably not all at once, but we would probably go to the high volume serology labs that we are already managing and working with this customer base or this niche market. One of the big questions that came up is, well, how do we fit this into the capacity of those non-labs? Because during an FMD outbreak, we're probably going to be pretty darn busy doing other things. And I think the short answer to that is that the majority of what we do, so our diagnostic lab, about half of the diagnostic testing that we do is for export, specifically for these regulatory concerns. And that is going to shift dramatically, as Dr. Brown told us, about the international market will diminish and go to zero almost immediately. So we do think that, and all of our labs share the same opinion, is that the serologic testing that was done for export certification will have plenty of capacity to do serological testing as appropriate and directed by our state animal health officials. We assume that that caseload would be approximately 10 to 15% of what we currently do now. So the goal for this, and how do we do and develop this, is to pursue pre-outbreak deployment. We don't want to wait for the outbreak and then deploy the test. That's what happened in COVID, right? And we want to be prepared and ready to go. But in order to do that, we have to have SOPs in place, and we have to be able to proficiency test our microbiologists in the known labs. Can you go to the next slide, please? And that's really the impetus behind Resolution 3, is that we're urging the overall goal is to make sure that we have a proficiency tested, a validated and proficiency tested serologic assay in our known labs. And that's really, by doing that, we want to urge USDA to develop the SOP and proficiency testing, and then to deploy those test kits out for pre-outbreak preparation. Then there are some draft policies to for result interpretation and reporting. And then we're going to ask and lean on our friends at SIA to help us with test frequency, to help us really guide and as a tool, because like what Dr. Konkle had just said, it's great to have a diagnostic test. Now, how do we interpret that? And how do we handle a negative or a non-negative test? And then we would, the last part is that we would prioritize and appropriate additional non-approved funding, and that would probably come out of Farm Bill funding, would be additional funding specifically for this, whether it would be done as a cooperative agreement or directed funds to the labs that are participating. I think the important part on that is that money is already approved, it's just not appropriated. And we know how complex you go from approval to appropriation. It all depends on what's happening and which way the wind is blowing. Okay, sorry, go ahead. Now, this is a little bit different. So remember, we moved from serologic assay looking for antibodies. So that's history of disease, right? We're going to move from that to evidence of active infection, or with antigen or pieces of the virus, nucleic acid of the virus, in an oral swab. This is a little bit different. This is not a deviation. This would be an emergency use authorization, because we'd have to develop and validate this test. So we know that RT-PCR is exceedingly sensitive and specific, but that's for animals with clinical signs. Now, that's a little bit different when you have non-clinical animals. It's the same issue we saw with the Binax nasal swab test for COVID. And there's a very large consequence to being wrong. This is a high consequence result. So we need to know more about what's happening for the PCR status in non-clinical animals. We do this quite a bit for endemic diseases, but they don't have the same consequence. So at first, we would need a deviation to be able to use the non-approved test to then be able to validate this assay for use in non-clinical animals, which would be an emergency use authorization. And this also, this is really important, is that it's not just a test. And I think Dr. Konkle talked about that as well, is it's not just a test. It's a test along with active observational surveillance. That goes the same with our ELISA assay. And then we also have cleaning and disinfection of any products that moves across the farm. And then we also have enhanced biosecurity plans. Now, remember, these are testing of animals. So why are we testing animals? For the ELISA, we're testing animals so they can produce and sell germplasm. This is different. This is part of what Dr. Brown had talked about, of moving the next generation of high genomic merit animals. Remember that really busy slide? We're talking about animal movement all over, because with the age of genomics, we're moving from new generations faster and faster. Every month, the next highest genomic merit bull is on the ground, and we need to get that animal off that farm of origin and into the hands of a high biosecurity rearing system, to make sure that we can protect that genetic advantage in the genetic market. The complicated part there is that those animals are coming from about 20 different states amongst the large AI collection centers and corporations, companies, whether they're making embryos or semen. So there's multiple parts involved. So this is the oral swab. It would be non-clinical animals to permit movement of these animals from a control zone. What do we have next? It's probably our last resolution. Okay, so the oral swab deviation to allow us to help us develop this assay is part of Appendix D. So oral PCR swab deviation for emergency use approval of this test to permit animals, clinically normal animals, and to preserve the genetics industry. That deviation process is quite complicated, but we use it on a regular basis. I think I signed a couple of deviations in the last few weeks about different non-protocol testing, because sometimes we have a reagent change, or we want to change how we report something, or maybe where you can use a different piece of equipment. So deviations are a normal part of null to make sure that the network can be responsive. And then we want to look at an outbreak scenario and a pre-outbreak scenario about how we get these deviations written and approved by the appropriate officials. But our goal is to make sure that this is in place before an outbreak happens, right? That makes logical sense, although that's not necessarily always how it goes, because we have other pending issues. So our goal is to have this in place before an outbreak, but that's really there's a lot of moving parts there. We have the non-program office. We're always talking to Dr. Lianico and her staff, MVSL for the and FADL for scientific expertise, and how are we going to have a reference laboratory? How are we all going to work together? And then remember what we talked about with multiple different states involved for where those animals are sourced and where they're moving into. So that's the reason why we had those three groups working together to put this plan together. Next slide, please. And that's really where we come in. That's the impetus and the background about where this fourth resolution comes from, is that we were looking for an oral swab deviation to use the established PCR assay that's already written for null, and we use that. We proficiency test on it, and we actually use that protocol a couple times a month when we're doing foreign animal disease investigations. Obviously, we've never found a non-negative. You'd know about that. This plan would be in action right now. But that really, the purpose of that is to do that deviation and then move to EUA during an outbreak. And then we would be urging FADL to look at sensitivity and sample collection. We absolutely would need SIA to help us with the epidemiology and the risk assessments for having a non-clinical animal with a diagnostic test. I think we have some other risk assessment data that's is approved for publication. It's not out yet. I just was checking when Dr. Konkle was talking. We haven't seen that, but that was spearheaded by Rory Meyer and CSS, and Charlie Brown as the director of the board of CSS. Really appreciate that work coming out. We're really hoping to utilize that as it's published. And then looking at the NPIC for drafting policy of those results. Remember, we're trying to interpret a negative result, or many of us veterinarians think it's negative. So let's move forward. And we're used to that with other diseases like highly pathogenic avian influenza. But there's a lot of information that went into those results and interpretation. And there's, that moves around. There's a lot of groups involved. And then looking at the NALM program office to define those guidelines for pre-outbreak deviation so we can get that stuff and all of our ducks in a row. And then obviously, again, that will cost money, right? Because we need some time and risk assessment funds, and then to be able to exercise that again at a later date. All right, I think that's the end of what I have. Semen PCR. we don't have a resolution for semen PCR. So and we're not gonna back burner it. We're actually gonna shelf it a little bit. But we know that probably our export partners are gonna want to know months down the line of they're gonna want to have an actual negative test of the product that they're importing. That's very common. The four diseases I can think of off the top of my head are BVD, leukosis, IBR, and EHD, and blue tongue. That's 5. But those are the 5 that we test for multiple markets for our export industry. We assume that those markets are going to want semen PCR as well. We can't just run that PCR, even if we have a validated oral swab. We're going to have to do another deviation and emergency use authorization to validate that. There are a lot of challenges with that because it's a very low priority for NALM, considering all of the other risks that they're dealing with and right now with our other agricultural species. So we tabled it. For now, we know that it's something that we're going to have to do. The good news here is that we have an inventory out there. If you go to any of those collection centers, they've got thousands of units in inventory, and we can maintain the industry as is now, and we would still have some export capacity, but we're going to need to continue that F1 development with our next generation of bulls to make sure that we can maintain our edge in the genetic market. And then we already talked about the oral swab. So I think that's it for that. Danelle, if you can move on. And I think that is now back to you.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. So what all of this culminated into is a draft guidance document, just a snapshot there on the screen. As with any exercise or guidance document like this, there's a whole list of assumptions. We give the industry overview that Dr. Brown just shared, the diagnostic testing options, and then we have 10 movement criteria for various stages of production of semen, embryos, and then the animal movement. So our working groups put in a lot of time. I help support the state animal health officials group, and we met at least monthly, sometimes twice a month. So I really appreciate all the efforts they put in to answer some of those hard questions. So this spring and summer, we really worked on this document. Everybody could live edit, talk through, throw darts at it, make it what it is. From that came those resolutions. So a lot of the background information that you have access to is directly out of this document. Any improvements folks want to suggest will be reflected in the document before we exercise it. We went through those 10 movement criteria, which you can see on your screen, and basically reached consensus. So our state animal health officials were able to review those, critique those, improve those. So those are the movement recommendations that will remain in this guidance document. We don't make policies, this is all guidance. And then we will exercise that in December. So a little tabletop exercise planned. Our project concludes the end of February, Leap Day, February 29th, 2024. And so anything that would help advance the science around secure milk supply, secure beef supply, any resources that the stakeholder group finds beneficial will be posted on those websites. And again, both of those projects are USDA funded.